morning everybody, ladies and gentlemen. Today I'm very happy and I have pleasure to participate in this esteemed conference. I'm very happy to share with you knowledge and to clarify some results about this research entitled Historic Reading of Colonial Urban Heritage through Morphology and Spatial Configuration, the case of Oued Zenati, town, Algeria. So, colonial urban fabrics in North Africa constitute significant yet contested component of built heritage, often overlooked due to their association with domination rather than cultural value. This paper examines the colonial urban structure of Oued Zenati through historical, morphological, and configurational approach, focusing exclusively on the colonial period, based on georeferenced historic colonial map, auxiliary construction, and archival photographic material. The study combines formal urban morphology inspired by body and space syntax analysis using depth map. The objective is to identify the spatial logic, hierarchy, and control mechanisms embedded in the colonial road system and to assess its coherence as a historical spatial system. The results reveal a highly planned orthogonal layout characterized by strong connectivity, high global integration, and pronounced control values along primary axis, confirming the efficiency and intentional hierarchy of the colonial design. Archival photographs validate the correspondence between configurational prominence and material expression in 3 dimensions, alignment, and architectural continuity. The study argues that the colonial fabric of Oued Zenati should be recognized as urban heritage, not merely in architectural terms, but as spatial legacy encoding historical models for governance and territorial rationalization. The colonial urban core of Oued Zenati, located in the wilaya of Khammar in northeastern Algeria, was founded during the French colonial period in 1863 on the banks of the Wadi Birn, the same name, as part of broader strategy of territorial control and European settlements, and initially developed around small colonial nucleus known as Sidi Temtem, which was subdivided from 1865 and gradually expanded in the following decades, forming the original urban core of the city and the spatial foundation for later growth. This colonial center was characterized by irregular grid-based urban layout with perpendicular streets and rectangular blocks, reflecting European planning principles that contrasted with the organic morphology of traditional North African Medina and facilitated circulation, land subdivision, and infrastructure installation, while also symbolizing order and modernity, and it concentrated the main administrative, educational, and public functions of the city, including the town hall, public offices, early schools, and central squares, thereby functioning as the institutional, social, and economic heart of Oued Zenati, where commercial activities, services, and symbolic public buildings converged to produce strong collective identity and a lasting urban structure that continues to shape the city's spatial organization today. In which concerning the material and methods used in this study, over this study we attempt to investigate the colonial urban fabric of Oued Zenati exclusively during the colonial period, with the aim of identifying its underlying morphological and spatial configuration. The analysis deliberately excludes post-colonial and contemporary transformations in order to preserve the internal coherence and the historical spatial system and to avoid anachronistic interpretations. The morphological choices are strictly conditioned by the available documentation, which consists of a historical colonial map and archival photographs. So the primary material is a historic colonial map depicting the planned urban layout and road system of Zenati. This map was digitized and georeferenced using QGIS based on geometric consistency and stable reference points identifiable in the archival material. The georeferenced map was then vectorized to extract the colonial road network and generate an axial representation suitable for configurational analysis. Archival photographs. A limited corpus of colonial area photographs was used as supplementary material. These images provide visual evidence of street hierarchy, building alignment, spatial enclosure, and the material expression of the road network. The photographs were not used as primary analytical data, but as mean of validating morphological and configurational interpretation derived from cartographic analysis. The morphological analysis. The qualitative analysis of the colonial fabric is grounded in architectural and urban morphology, inspired by Bori, focusing on the structural logic of the built environment. The analysis addresses the geometry and regularity of the street network, the hierarchy of access, block formation, and the repetition of standardized urban format characteristics of colonial planning. This approach allows the identification of the formal principles governing the organization of space independently of contemporary uses. Configurational analysis. Space syntax. An axial map of the colonial road network was constructed from the vectorized historic map and analyzed using depth map software. Four configurational measures were calculated: the connectivity, integration, choice, control. These metrics enable the identification of spatial hierarchy, functional efficiency, and mechanisms of spatial control embedded in the colonial layout. So the photographic validation. To enhance analytical robustness, the space syntax results were cross-checked with archival photographs, highly integrated and controlling access were compared with their material characteristics as observed in historic images, confirming the correspondence between configuration, prominence, and physical expression. This validation reinforces the reliability of the results without introducing perceptual or behavioral assumptions. The methodological limitations. The study is limited by the exclusive use of historical sources and the absence of contemporary spatial data. However, given the research focus on colonial planning logic and inherited spatial threat, the adopted method is appropriate and sufficient. The morphological analysis of the colonial urban fabric of Zenati is conducted in strict accordance with Boris formal logic, which conceptualizes urban form as an autonomous structural system governed by internal rules of organization, repetition, and hierarchy. Within this theory framework, urban morphology is not approached through perceptual, functional, or social behavioral interpretations, but rather through the reading of geometric configurations, spatial relations, and typological regularities embedded in the plan. The analysis is therefore deliberately restricted to the colonial period, relying exclusively on georeferenced historical cartographic material and archival photographs in order to preserve the internal coherence of the formal system and the study and to avoid interpretative distortions introduced by contemporary transformations. At the primary level, the street network constitutes the fundamental structure and elements of the colonial fabric. Its clear orthogonality, continuity, and hierarchical differentiation reveal rational planning logic based on geometric control and spatial regularity. The main structure in axis exhibits greater width, linear continuity, and directional clarity, functioning as organizing spines that define block orientation and regulate parcel subdivision. Secondary threads, while subordinate in hierarchy, maintain geometric consistency and reinforce the legibility of the grid. This dominance of the thread system reflects Boris' principle of formal primacy, according to which urban coherence emerges for relational structures rather than from isolated architectural objects. Urban blocks are interpreted as secondary morphological units generated by the intersection of the street network. Their irregular rectangular geometry and repetitive dimensions indicate standardized planning logic aimed at spatial efficiency and cadastral rationalization. The blocks don't possess intrinsic meaning in isolation, rather their significance derives from their systematic repetition and alignment with broader urban structure. This reinforces Boris' conception of morphology as system of relations where form is produced through serial logic and control variation rather than individual differentiation. At a finer scale, the parcel system further expresses their logic of formal rationality. Plots are characterized by standardized width, regular depth, and repetitive subdivision patterns, clearly subordinated to the geometry of blocks and streets. These nested hierarchy threads, block, parcel threads, the top-down morphological order consistent with colonial planning doctrines, and fully aligned with Boris' analytical emphasis on structural dependency between scales. The parcel layout thus functions not as an autonomous design element but as formal consequence of the primary urban framework. Institutional and public buildings identified on the historic map, such as the church, administrative buildings, and civic facilities, are interpreted as formal singularities within an otherwise repetitive fabric. In accordance with Boris' logic, these elements are not analyzed through stylistic or symbolic attributes, but through their strategies, spatial position, volumetric prominence, and relational dominance within the street network. Their placement along primary axis or at nodal intersections introduces moments of hierarchy and centrality, reinforcing the overall spatial order without disrupting the formal coherence of the grid. Finally, the sharp demarcation between the planned colonial fabric and the surrounding agricultural and natural landscape is understood as decisive morphological boundary. This boundary delineates the closure and autonomy of the colonial urban system, emphasizing its internal coherence and intentional separation from the pre-existing rural matrix. Such spatial discontinuity is interpreted as an integral component of the formal logic of colonial urbanism, consistent with Boris' conception of urban form as delimited and internally regulated construct. By adopting Boris' formal logic, this morphological analysis deliberately avoids descriptive, stylistic, or functional readings, and instead reveals the underlying structural system governing the colonial urban fabric of Zenati. This rigorous qualitative interpretation provides robust theoretical foundation for the subsequent configurational analysis using space syntax, ensuring methodological coherence between morphological structure and quantitative spatial measures. So the space syntax analysis. Firstly, we start by the connectivity. The axial connectivity analysis generated by depth map for the colonial core of the rural town of Zenati focused on historic colonial map reveals clear hierarchical structure with it that is explicitly reflected in the legend values ranging from 5 low connectivity to 147 high connectivity. The most connected axial lines displayed in red and orange with values approaching 147 correspond to the primary longitudinal streets that structure the colonial fabric. Their high number of intersections confirms their role as dominant spatial distributors of movement, visibility and control access. Access with intermediate connectivity values shown in yellow and green represent secondary collector streets that articulate the regular grid and redistribute flows toward internal urban blocks. In contrast, the lowest connectivity values shown in blue tones and close to 5 are associated with peripheral streets and service routes characterized by limited intersections and restricted permeability. This strong gradient between high and low connectivity values demonstrates that the colonial road system of Zenati was intentionally designed to concentrate accessibility along selected corridors while limiting transversal movements. Elsewhere, reflecting colonial logic of spatial efficiency and control, whose configurational effects persist today as structural component of the town's urban heritage. This is a map of the axial connectivity. Integration. The global integration analysis generated with depth map for the colonial core of the rural town of Zenati based on the historic map reveals pronounced spatial hierarchy clearly expressed by the legend values. So the most integrated axial lines shown in red and orange with values approaching 4 corresponding to the primary structural streets that run longitudinally through the colonial core and intersect multiple secondary axes. These streets occupy the most accessible positions within the overall system, requiring the fewest topological steps to reach all other streets. Axes with intermediate integration values displayed in yellow and light green represent secondary and tertiary streets that ensure functional continuity within the grid while remaining subordinate to the main structural corridors. The control map of the colonial core of Zenati generated through depth map and based on the road network extracted from historical map reveals strongly hierarchical spatial structure in which limited number of main axes constraints the highest control value up to 13, indicating their strategic role in regulating access and distributing movement within the urban system in line with space syntax theory. The choice map highlights strong differentiation in the distribution of through movement with the highest choice values concentrated along the main longitudinal and transversal axis, indicating that these routes function as primary corridors for movement and passage across the urban system in accordance with space syntax theory. The intelligibility analysis of the colonial core of Zenati indicates relatively strong and positive relationship. Archie square is 0.62, indicating that the urban system is highly intelligible in the sense of space syntax theory. From the perspective of an integrated morphological and configurational analysis, the archival photographs of the colonial core of Zenati provide precise and methodologically robust validation of both the Bori-based formal reading and the space syntax results. The panoramic view of Zenati first confirms the existence of compact, clearly delimited colonial fabric, sharply distinguished from the surrounding agricultural landscape. This visual evidence corroborates the morphological interpretation of the colonial town as an autonomous formal system governed by internal geometric rules and hierarchical organization, and simultaneously supports the configurational observation that accessibility and movement are concentrated within closed and controlled network rather than diffused into the real matrix. So, the combined morphological and configurational analysis of the colonial core of Zenati reveals highly ordered urban system shaped by rational colonial planning. The regular grid, hierarchical street network, repetitive blocks, and standardized parcels reflect a top-down logic based on formal coherence and spatial control rather than organic growth. Space syntax results confirm this hierarchy by showing that the main axes concentrate the highest value of connectivity, integration, choice, and control, making them the dominant corridors for movements and accessibility. This demonstrates strong correspondence between morphological structure and configurational performance, where the streets generate an urban form also organize circulation and spatial dominance. Institutional buildings reinforce this hierarchy through their strategic placement along a highly integrated axis, strengthening nodal centrality and visibility within the urban system. Photographic observations further validates this finding, showing clear visual corridors and facades continuity along dominant streets, while secondary streets remain more segregated and visually marginal. Overall, the study demonstrates that the colonial core functions as coherent and intelligible spatial system in which morphology, configuration, and built form converge to maintain stable urban logic that continues to structure the town today. This study demonstrates that the colonial core of Zenati is highly structured urban system shaped by a clear hierarchical logic through the combined use of bodies, morphological framework, and space syntax analysis. The research revealed that the colonial fabric was organized through top-down planning logic, where primary streets generated regular blocks, parcels, and spatial order. Space syntax results confirm that the main colonial axis concentrates accessibility, movement, and spatial control, while secondary streets remain more segregated. Historical photographs further validates this finding by showing the material expression of this hierarchy through street-wide facade alignment and institutional position. So, beyond Oued Zenati, the study highlights how colonial towns in North Africa were designed as controlled and intelligible spatial system. Methodologically, it demonstrates the relevance of combining morphological and configurational approach for understanding historical urban fabrics and supporting future heritage and urban studies. So, and thank you for your attention. And if you have any question, don't hesitate to contact me with my best regards.